Hey everybody, back with another video. In this video, we are going to talk briefly about what is pride. This isn't meant to be all comprehensive. This is a launching off point. So we're going to be covering this topic fairly briefly. I'll be brushing on all of the high points. So let's get started. Homosexuality was illegal in most parts of the world. Being LGBTQIA, any of these identities were considered sexual deviance. In the medical community, it was considered a mental illness to be any of these things for a very long time. And even in the mental health community, this was considered a mental illness. And you could be hospitalized. You could have shock treatment, all sorts of terrible things, chemical treatments to erase your sexuality. All sorts of terrible things were done to people to quote-unquote correct this quote-unquote illness during this time. And this was true in the United States for most of the United States history up until fairly recently. And there was this legislation that happened during this time, during the 20th century, called the Lavender Scare. And what the Lavender Scare is, that term refers to oppressive legislation towards the LGBTQIA community during a huge chunk of the 20th century. The title itself is wordplay. It's play on the term Red Scare. Red Scare is referring to an irrational fear communist infiltration. So of the communists coming over and taking over American culture and American civilization. That amounted to really nothing more than the proverbial witch hunt. And these hunts served to negatively affect the lives of thousands of American citizens. It struck needless fear into the hearts of middle America. As a matter of fact, a lot of the anti-LGBTQIA scare language and rhetoric that we still hear today was invented during this time, or kind of came around during this time. And so while we still see in kind of the corners of our legislative bodies, we see some of this fear-mongering still existing, but it's to a much lesser extent than it was. Most bars and clubs during the 20th century would not allow gay people to patronize their shops. So again, not only was homosexuality illegal, but it was also considered immoral and a mental illness. So by the 1950s, the only bars that would allow homosexuals into their establishments were owned by the mafia. The mafia would use these clubs to launder money. They were not always well taken care of. They were usually pretty seedy kind of establishments, but because they were the crux of the illegal activity by these mafia members, they weren't at all concerned with their clientele. They didn't care who came in the door. And so this became a safe haven for gay people to attend and to go into and be themselves. Now, the police were very aware of these establishments, and they used the mafia laundering schemes as an excuse to go in and bust these establishments, to conduct raids on these establishments. And they would do this from time to time. From the police's standpoint, it was kind of, pardon the expression, killing two birds with one stone. And during these raids, they would treat gay people inside very bad. They would beat them, they would drag them outside, they would make fun of them, they would throw them outside to be gathered up in a paddy wagon and taken to jail. The next day, you would see a list of names and sometimes the professions of these people listed in the newspaper. And so people would lose their jobs over this. They would lose their marriages, their homes, etc. It would literally devastate people and ruin their lives. So not only do they have a criminal record for being a sexual deviant, but they would also be publicly shamed. So many of these folks would eventually become homeless, and they'd have to turn to dealing drugs or sex work just to survive. By the 1960s, we start to see the civil rights movement be in full swing. And because of this civil rights movement, this really made a lot of marginalized people start to take a look at how they were being treated, and they started to become discontent with this kind of treatment. The LGBTQIA community being among those minority groups. And so while some of the laws had changed over time, so that being homosexual, for example, was no longer illegal in New York City by the 60s, the police would still harass these people, and they would still haul them off to jail, taunt them in the streets, make fun of them, all this sort of thing, and just give them generally a hard time. So tensions started to rise as more social political movements became active in the late 1960s, and the counterculture created an environment for more progressive ideas. So therefore, in the early morning hours of June 28, 1969, at the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village, New York City, the police decided they would conduct another routine raid. Little did they know it would be their last. Now, it's unknown who started the resistance that night, but buoyed on by smaller resistances that had happened throughout the city earlier in the decade, this once routine raid quickly turned into a riot. So we start to see the patrons of the bar start to push back against the police force who are trying to bully and harass them. Meanwhile, bystanders outside the bar start to gather around, and Greenwich Village became this counterculture, kind of the hub of counterculture, and they were annoyed and irritated by the police treatment of the homosexuals as well, and of the LGBTQIA community. Bystanders outside of the bar and patrons within the bar both started to resist and push back against the police show of force. And they eventually pinned these police down between these two progressively angry and very fed up groups of people. Eventually, the police had to run into the very Stonewall Inn that they had tried to raid, and they barricaded themselves inside and tried to call for backup from the police force. This riot lasted 2 complete days. Now, more reinforcements did come, and they were able to break up the riots both days, but it still was this moment of civil unrest. The police often said, were heard to have said, we didn't expect, these people to push back. They'd always been so passive before because they were always terrified of what this might do to their lives. But now the tide was changing, and the world was changing, and the world was becoming more aware of what being gay and being LGBT meant. And so they started to push back, and they started to expect more equal treatment. So the police were just not used to the gay community lashing out, but they had clearly had enough. And this event sparked organization and activism within the LGBTQIA community that had never been seen before. This is, while not the first protest, while not the biggest riot necessarily, this is probably one of the most reported on and one of the most famous riots. And so this is really what galvanized the LGBTQIA community into a cohesive whole and allowed them to speak up for themselves for the first time. Every year after that riot, to keep the memory and the activism alive, a parade has been held to commemorate those brave people who fought for their rights on that day. So it started out as just a way to keep that memory alive, to just keep people remembering, look, we're not putting up with this anymore. It wasn't just a one-time thing. They were worried about those riots being forgotten and the little ground that they were able to gain from that kind of visibility to be forgotten. They wanted to be remembered. Right? We still aren't going to take this. We still aren't going to be pushed around. We still aren't going to be thrown in jail for just being who we are. And so they started this tradition of every year having this parade as a reminder, as a visible reminder of we are here and you have to deal with us, right? You have to accept that that's who we are.